Hi, everybody. I'm Katina McHenry. Thank you for joining us today on our Big Ideas Show, where we take a deeper look at faculty research happening here at the McCombs School of Business at the University of Texas at Austin. Joining me today is Andrew Brodsky. He is Assistant Professor of Management. And today we are talking about remote working, how that's going to look, bringing people back to the office. His research focuses in that area, and he's been featured recently in several national publications regarding his research and his work. So that's what we're talking about today. Welcome, Andrew. It's great to see you.
Great. It's good to see you virtually.
Yes, once again, we're still here virtually.
Yes, we all are.
Yeah. So you were recently featured in the Harvard Business Review talking about the implications of remote working. So I'd love to know what your opinions have been of the last year and a half in the remote working setting, and what that says about just the workforce and how we're able to still operate and function in that way.
Sure. So, when people were asking me 6 months ago if I thought companies were going to stay virtual, my response then is, I think employees will want to stay virtual, but I think companies are going to try and bring people back. And unless there's a tight labor market, then, employees are not going to have a choice in the matter. So interestingly, we kind of ended up in this situation where we have a tight labor market. So you see a lot of companies who are kind of trying to bring their employees back, but employees were saying, no, we've actually grown to like this virtual work and the flexibility that allows us. And as a result, we've seen some kind of companies reversing their policies on that stuff. So yeah, it's been interesting to watch everything unfold over the last 6 months here in terms of changes as life comes back to normal and seems to be moving towards a new normal.
Yeah, this is something you've been looking at and studying for a long time since, obviously before COVID. So when you first started looking at it, how do you think just the industry of work and the workforce, the labor force, how has it changed to be better accommodating? And I think it's something you've written about, where you said that companies will have to think about implementing some kind of remote working policy even before COVID. So how have you noticed the changes since you started looking at this?
Yeah, remote work has been particularly great, especially for people who are often underrepresented in organizations or have other issues due to, they're a single parent taking care of children, or maybe they do have a spouse, but kind of the child care still falls on them, or other reasons they might not be as easily able to commute to work. Maybe they don't have a car. So remote work trend has kind of unintentionally increased inclusivity a whole lot. And it's beyond that, it's kind of had a lot of nice other benefits, cutting out commute time, all that stuff. And I think organizations have gotten better at kind of using remote workers. The big challenge that's coming up now is organizations seem to be, giving people the option. Do you want to work from home or do you want to work from the office? And the risk is that, remote workers, they don't have as much face time with bosses. Managers don't see them working. They don't kind of get that, schmoozing and social networking in the office as much. So there's a risk that if organizations don't handle this process well, that virtual workers will kind of become second-class citizens and miss out on resources and promotion and all those kind of things. So, this is a key thing to focus on as organizations are bringing people back, is to make sure that all these benefits gained by virtual work aren't kind of lost by giving too many extra advantages to those who just happen to come back in person or able to for some reason.
Yeah, when you say extra advantages, can you talk about that specifically? What does that mean? And does it vary depending on the organization and the size of the organization?
Sure, happy to. So there's research on stuff called the input bias or face time that basically shows that, in a lot of jobs, figuring out what exactly is performance is kind of a little bit ambiguous. So you can think about, for certain jobs, it's very clear, right? You got sales goals, you meet your sales goals or not. But for someone whose job is more kind of a little bit unclear what the exact goals is, for people kind of in marketing positions, for instance, or publicity positions, it's hard for managers to evaluate how people perform. So historically, and not necessarily intentionally, managers often evaluate people based on how hard they see them working, due to kind of lack of other good criteria. And the problem with that is, if you can't physically see employees working, you don't get to see that extra hard work. So, if you got half your employees and you can physically see them working, the idea is that you will many managers will think those people are harder working than those at home who may be getting their work done, but managers aren't able to observe the process as easily. So as a
Sure.
result, they might get worse performance evaluations, they might get passed up for promotions. And then the other thing is, the water cooler talk, right? Like a lot of stuff in organizations happens kind of through these informal interactions. And unfortunately for virtual workers, they're kind of have less access to that than those workers who are in the office, which potentially creates this risk of kind of two tiers of workers, which is really not ideal for organizations because you're often going to see those virtual workers as the kinds of people who you want to make sure you have in the organization, who for one reason or another might not be able to be there in person, and you don't want them to kind of get penalized for that factor.
Sure. So it sounds like there are two different ways to look at this depending on the kind of worker, the organization, et cetera. So I'd love for you to expand a little bit on the benefits of having a remote working policy and also the benefits of having the in-person interactions, because I think in certain organizations, it's very important to have those interactions because a lot is lost in the virtual setting. When you have to communicate with people and you work in teams, you have to have sometimes, you have to, that recognition of gestures and body language and all that stuff is so important that's many times lost in a virtual setting. So can you talk about both?
Sure. So, first I'll talk about what's lost, because I've been talking about the good things so far mostly. At least as far as gestures go, newer research shows that people are actually able to adapt to email pretty well, particularly for people who you're familiar with. So for instance, if you get an email from a stranger, there's often a lot of misinterpretation. You have to read through the lines. But if you were to get an email from your spouse or your best friend, there's no misinterpretation there. You know exactly what's between the lines. But that said, there are definitely downsides. We in our own research, we've seen that communication with those outside of people's specific teams has decreased meaningfully since people started working virtually. So, the idea is, cross-team communication has gone down because, there's a lot less possibility for these informal interactions or, building these cross-team processes that happen more often in person. And the problem with that is that a lot of innovation occurs when you have people communicate with those in the organization who they don't normally.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So if you're working with your team all the time, you've got all the same shared information. So there's not a lot of room to innovate. But all of a sudden, when you have someone from, say, a marketing team talk to someone in a finance team, and they bring some ideas back from finance, they can kind of use that new knowledge to innovate on their existing processes. And we're concerned, based on some of the data we see, that some of that is going to be lost. So, these informal interactions that often happen in the office, or these kind of ones that happen more outside of the team, are definitely potentially problematic.
Yeah.
As well as for new employees, not being able to get socialized into the organization as easily. A lot of these informal ways of learning about the culture and learning, what's acceptable versus not. A lot of these unspoken rules are really much more easily figured out, in person when you can informally interact with people. And when people are being onboarded virtually, potentially some of that is being missed as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been interesting. Even on our team, we have onboarded three new people in the last year. And we've all been talking about how weird it's going to be to actually meet them in person and to actually see them, face to face. It'll be really weird. But I felt for them because I've never onboarded virtually, and we've had a couple of people who've moved from out of state and just from a different city have moved here. So I can't imagine how difficult that transition has been for them. But like you said, we're totally adaptable creatures. So what do you think the last year, just being in COVID, has proved about productivity? And I think particularly in an organization like ours at UT, like 50,000 plus people, students, faculty, and staff, had to, and I hate to use the word pivot because it's been so overused, but had to adapt to a new way of doing the job. So what do you think it's proved, not just with our organization, but many others across the globe?
Yeah, there's an interesting debate going on where there are like some CEOs saying, productivity is worse at home. There are other ones saying it's actually better at home. I fall on the viewpoint that, at least based on the data that I've been seeing, that productivity has been improving somewhat. I mean, people are, for people who commute, they immediately gain back 2 hours of their day,
Yeah.
if they commute an hour each way. But even beyond that, it seems like giving people kind of more flexibility and control over their work on average seems to have had a little bit of a benefit at least. That said, this is not universally true. For some people, virtual work has worked for better than others. So although the average might be slightly improved, it is not necessarily true for all people. And it's the same in the office, right? Some people happen to be more productive or less productive in office. So this idea of flexibility and what works best for each employee, will be the kind of key area for the future to think about, to be able to maximize performance across, different types of employees, whether it's their family situation, personality characteristics or abilities. That'll be key going forward.
Yeah. Has there been any evidence or research that that speaks to if people are working more because their offices are at home and their offices are like right outside of their bedrooms and they can just go to their desk or whatever the space they designate in their house to work? Do you think people have been working more because of that?
Yeah, so the data that I've seen, both from our own collection as well as others, does seem like the workday has extended.
Mhm.
And we've also seen that people feel more time pressure when they are working at home, that they just don't have enough time to get everything done.
Yeah.
And this is due to two factors. One is reduced boundaries. So for instance, the big company I'm working with, we're working with their call center employees. It used to be, you're in the office, you take your calls, you'd be on the call queue, 5 o'clock, whatever time your day was done, you'd go home. Now you've got this issue where theoretically you could take calls at any point of the day, and you have to, like, if you have callbacks to customers, you may feel the need to do that later at night. So the idea is that these barriers for ways that we engage with work have been lowered very heavily,
Mhm.
and also there's less clear end of the day.
Right.
When for many jobs there's a clear what, I'm done, I'm going home. Maybe you'd have a couple emails a night, but now when you're not leaving the office at a set time, there's kind of this incentive to work more and more, so you look good for your manager, because they don't see you sitting there in the office at 5, so they know till 5, they don't know you're working. So people feel they need to show that in their work output, which seems to be increasing the amount of time people are working, unfortunately.
Yeah. What other negative aspects? We've talked about the positives. We're talking about a negative one right
Yeah.
now. What other negative aspects have you noticed about remote working?
Yeah, I mean, you're seeing a lot of people who are talking about Zoom fatigue, right? This idea that you're on webcam all the time and you're looking at your own face all the time, and it's exhausting. Some of my research actually suggests that there's a lot of benefit to still meeting with people, but turning webcams off. And you're also seeing people feeling a bit more isolated.
Mhm.
And that's not just due to work being virtual, but everything's being virtual. Um, but if people are, it's interesting. We've seen kind of a shift in preferences where people are trying to replace their work interactions, with other things. So, there's some arguments being made that's, part of why people are buying more land and bigger houses,
Yeah.
so they can have more activities, as opposed to, where they got some of that stimulation from interacting with people in real life previously.
Do you think that remote working has improved the work-life balance? Because I think you've talked about that and been have written about that as well. So I mean, I think that that's something that people are demanding more of, and I think it's one of the things that we've been forced to really think about and evaluate during COVID, because we're with our families all the time. So how has the work-life balance, do you think, improved?
I think it's been an interesting double-edged sword. So people now have a lot more control over their time when they're working virtually, but because of the decreased barriers, there's been more interruptions. So, it's so important for organizations to think about, how can we, with virtual workers, rebuild some of those barriers in ways that allow them to kind of have that separation. Because we're seeing in our own research that I've done with some doctoral students here, um, is that, like, this decrease in barriers creates anxiety.
Mm.
And these things can hurt work performance in the end. So it's not just in the interest of workers themselves to be able to kind of rebuild some of these barriers, but organizations as well, to ensure that employees can be mentally at their top state and perform best.
Yeah.
Um,
So as we end today, what are some things you think companies need to be thinking about as we slowly continue to reopen between now and over the next 6 months or so?
Yeah. I mean, for me, I think there's a few big things. One, don't lose sight of all the gains we had during virtual work.
Mhm.
Tons of time was saved due to decreasing commutes. A lot of people who might not have been able to go to the offices easily now have kind of more central role in their workplaces. There's more inclusion there. I think there's two big kind of things to be careful of though going forward. One, when you start having hybrid office places where some people are in person and some are working virtually, how to make sure that one group isn't necessarily prioritized over the other. And then the second is thinking about support for virtual workers. This idea that when you work from home and there's no longer an office, theoretically you could be on for all hours of the day. So, figuring out structures to put in place so that, work for virtual workers doesn't bleed into their entire lives. And they can be productive during certain parts of the day, but they're allowed to be off for others.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Andrew. We have been talking with Assistant Professor of Management, Andrew Brodsky, here at the McCombs School of Business. We will have links to some of his work in the description of this video. Thank you so much again for joining us today on our Big Ideas Show. We will see you next time, and be sure to check out some of our other videos as well.
Thank you very much.